The wind was a raw thing, born on the barren plains and dying a bitter death in the jagged teeth of the mountains. Down below, the land was a cracked canvas of dun and ochre, where dust devils danced in a frenzy, tasting of grit and broken promises. But here, as the ground clawed its way upward, the dust turned to mud, the mud to a crust of ice, and the air grew thin and sharp enough to slice a lung. Early spring in the high country was not a season of rebirth, but a final, desperate clench of winter's fist. Trees stood like skeletons, their bare limbs rattling a hollow tune, and patches of old, stubborn snow clung to the shadows like shrouds. Through this unforgiving world, a girl stumbled. Her name was Clara, though it had been a long time since anyone had used it with kindness. Her feet, bare and bruised, left faint, bloody prints on the frozen earth and snow. The thin cotton of her dress, torn and stained with the grime of a long journey, offered no comfort against the biting cold. Each breath was a painful gasp, a small cloud of steam stolen by the wind. She had been running for what felt like a lifetime, but it could have only been a day and a night. She had leaped from the back of a jostling wagon when the two men driving it had stopped to argue over a bottle of cheap whiskey. They were taking her to a new man, a third man, but she had decided that two was enough. The cold sank into her bones, dredging up memories she fought to keep buried. It was a cold like the silence in the room the day her father sold her. He had been a farmer with hands calloused from work and a spirit withered by drought. He had looked at her not as a daughter, but as his last crop to sell before the land took everything. The man he sold her to, Silas, was a gambler with a smile as slick as the cards he kept up his sleeve. He smelled of sweat and stale tobacco, and he'd paid her father in a handful of worn silver dollars that were gone before the week was out. Her father had not met her eyes as he'd handed her over. That was the first time she'd learned she was a commodity, a thing to be traded for survival. Life with Silas was a blur of smoky saloons and the constant, unnerving rattle of dice. He did not beat her, not in the way some men did, with their fists. He used a different kind of cruelty, a casual neglect that made her feel less than human. She was a good luck charm when he was winning, a thing to be ignored or loaned out when he was not. And then came the night his luck ran dry. The air in the saloon was thick with tension, the lamplight casting long, dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. She had been standing in the corner, a silent fixture, watching the cards fall. The pot grew, a mountain of coins and crumpled bills. Silas, sweating and pale, had nothing left to bet. Across the table sat Jedediah Horn, a merchant with a face like a clenched fist and eyes as small and hard as pebbles. He owned the town's general store and half the land around it. He looked from Silas's empty hands to Clara, and a slow, unpleasant smile spread across his lips. "I'll see your bet," Horn had said, his voice a low rumble. "And I'll raise you everything in the pot for the girl." The saloon went quiet. Even the drunkards paused their slurring. Silas looked at her then, his eyes hollow. There was no hesitation. He saw not a wife, not a person, but a final, desperate wager. He nodded. The cards were turned. A king for Horn, a jack for Silas. It was over that quickly. Horn scraped the pot toward him with one meaty hand and then pointed a thick finger at her. "My winnings," he'd grunted. "Come along." That was the second time. She had been passed from a gambler who saw her as a chip to a merchant who saw her as merchandise. Horn was a different kind of man. He believed that what he bought, he owned completely. His hands were heavy, his temper short. She was his servant, his cook, his bed warmer, an object to absorb his frustrations with the world. The bruises she now carried were his handiwork, angry purple marks that mapped his ownership on her skin. He had decided to trade her again, for a plot of timberland owned by a man even deeper in the mountains. The two men in the wagon were simply the delivery agents. But now, she was no one's. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. She was free, but freedom in this wilderness was just another word for a slow death. Her legs trembled, not just from the cold, but from a hunger so deep it felt as if her stomach was eating itself. The world began to swim, the skeletal trees blurring into a gray watercolor. She tripped on an exposed root, her body too weak to catch itself, and tumbled down a short, steep embankment into a shallow ravine. The fall knocked the last of the air from her lungs. She lay there, half buried in a drift of snow, the sharp edges of rocks digging into her back. The pain was distant. A strange warmth began to spread through her limbs, a comfortable, heavy numbness. This is it, she thought, a quiet resignation settling over her. This is the end of the transaction. She closed her eyes, the wind whispering a final, cold lullaby. A sound cut through the haze, a soft snort. Close by, it was the sound of a living, breathing creature. Her eyelids fluttered open. A horse stood at the edge of the ravine, its breath pluming in the frigid air. It was a large, dark beast, its coat thick for the mountain winter. And then a shadow fell over her. A man. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a thick, dark beard that hid the bottom half of his face. He wore a heavy sheepskin coat and a worn hat pulled low against the wind. He slid down the embankment with a sureness that spoke of familiarity with the rough terrain, his movements economical and silent. He knelt beside her, and she flinched, a lifetime of instinct screaming at her to recoil from a man's touch. But he did not touch her. He simply looked, his eyes a pale, startling gray that seemed to take in her torn dress, her bare feet, her bruised face, without judgment or surprise. They were the eyes of a man who had seen worse things. After a long moment, he reached down. His hands were large and calloused, but his touch was surprisingly gentle as he slipped one arm under her back and another beneath her knees. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest, but she was too weak to fight. He carried her up the embankment and swung her onto the saddle of his horse before mounting behind her. He wrapped one arm around her waist to hold her steady, his grip firm but impersonal. He did not speak a single word. He simply nudged the horse forward, and they moved deeper into the silent, snow-dusted woods. Clara drifted in and out of consciousness, her head lolling against the solid wall of his chest. The rhythmic sway of the horse was a cradle, the man's presence a silent, imposing reality. She was being taken again, but this time felt different. There was no rough handling, no leering words, only a profound, unsettling silence. She awoke to the smell of wood smoke and the crackle of a fire. She was lying on a pallet of furs near a stone hearth. A rough woolen blanket was tucked around her. She was in a small, one-room cabin. The walls made of sturdy, expertly fitted logs. The space was sparse and immaculately clean. A simple table and 2 chairs stood in the center. A bed was tucked into one corner, and shelves holding a few books, tins of food, and neatly folded clothes lined one wall. There were no decorations, no signs of a life shared with others. It was the home of a man who lived entirely alone. The man was there, his back to her, tending a pot over the fire. He moved with a slight, almost imperceptible limp, favoring his right leg. He seemed unaware that she was awake. She watched him, her body tense, every nerve on edge. She was waiting for the demand, the look, the moment when he would turn and claim his payment for saving her. It was the only currency she had ever known. He eventually turned, holding a wooden bowl of steaming stew. He saw she was awake, and his gray eyes met hers for a moment. There was no expression on his face. He walked over and set the bowl on the floor beside her, along with a cup of water and a piece of dark bread. Then he went back to the other side of the room and sat in one of the chairs, picking up a piece of leather and a knife and beginning to work, his attention completely absorbed. He had not spoken. He had not asked her name. He had not told her his... The stew was thick with meat and vegetables. and the warmth spread through her shivering body, a small miracle of life. She ate slowly, every muscle aching, watching him over the rim of the bowl. He never looked up. When she finished, she set the bowl aside and curled up under the blanket, exhausted but unable to sleep. She was a cornered animal, uncertain if the hand that had fed her would be the same one to strike. Later, he rose and retrieved a basin of warm water and a clean cloth. He knelt beside her again. Clara froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. He gestured to her feet. They were a mess of cuts and bruises, swollen and blue with cold. Hesitantly, she allowed him to lift one foot onto his lap. His touch was clinical, detached. He cleaned the dirt and grime from the wounds with a slow, methodical patience. He wrapped her feet in clean strips of cloth and then, without a word, moved to the cuts on her arms and the bruise blooming on her cheek. He never let his eyes linger, never let his touch stray. He was tending to an injury, nothing more. When he was done, he stood and took a spare cot that was folded against the wall, setting it up on the opposite side of the hearth. He laid out a blanket and a pillow, her space, and his, a clear, unspoken boundary. He banked the fire for the night, and in the dim, flickering light, he undressed down to his trousers and a worn undershirt before lying down on his own cot, turning his back to her. Clara lay awake for hours, listening to the sound of his steady breathing and the howl of the wind outside. This man was a puzzle. Every instinct, honed by years of mistreatment, told her to be afraid, but his actions spoke a different language, one of quiet decency, of boundaries she did not know a man could possess. Still, the fear remained, a cold knot in her stomach. Sooner or later, all men took what they wanted. The next morning, the world outside was a wall of white. A storm had descended during the night, burying the cabin in a thick blanket of snow. They were trapped. For days, the blizzard raged, a howling gale that shook the sturdy cabin. The world shrank to the four walls of the small room, the fire in the hearth and the heavy silence between them. She began to notice the small things about him. He was gentle with his horse, murmuring to it in a low, soft voice when he went to the small, attached lean-to to feed it. He had no whiskey, no spirits of any kind. His evenings were spent reading by the fire or mending harnesses with a quiet focus. The cabin was a place of solitude, but also of peace. There was no judgment in his silence, no anger simmering beneath the surface. And there was that limp, a reminder of some old pain he carried without complaint. The nights were the worst for her. The past did not stay buried in sleep. It rose up in fractured, terrifying images. Silas's slick smile, Horn's heavy fist, the faceless men in the wagon. She would whimper in her sleep, her body thrashing against the phantom hands that held her down. She would wake with a choked cry, her heart racing, the scent of fear in her nostrils. One night, the nightmare was particularly vivid. She cried out, a raw, desperate sound. She expected him to wake her, to perhaps be angry at the disturbance. But he did not. When her eyes shot open, she saw, in the faint glow of the dying embers, that he had moved. He had gotten up from his cot and dragged it across the floor. It was now only a few feet from her own pallet. He lay on his side, facing her, a silent, watchful guardian. He had not touched her, had not spoken. He had simply closed the distance, offering his presence as a shield against the darkness. It was the kindest thing anyone had ever done for her. The next day, the storm had passed, but the silence between them felt different. It was less heavy, less fraught with her fear. She found her voice, a rusty, little-used thing. "Elias," she said. It was a name she had seen carved into the handle of one of his knives. He looked up from his work, his gray eyes meeting hers. He did not seem surprised that she had spoken. He simply gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough. She had given him a name. She spent the day helping, tidying the cabin, patching one of his shirts with the small sewing kit he gave her. A quiet routine began to form, a rhythm of shared tasks and unspoken understanding. He was Elias now. She was a person who lived in his cabin. That evening, as he handed her a plate of food, his fingers brushed against hers. She did not flinch. He looked at her, his expression unreadable in the firelight. "Clara," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly thing, rough from disuse. It was the first time he had spoken her name. He said it just once, a simple acknowledgement of her existence. But for a girl who had been called property, winnings, and girl, hearing her own name spoken with such plain, simple gravity felt like being given back a piece of her soul. She held it close in the quiet of the cabin, a small, warm thing to guard against the vast, cold wilderness outside. The thaw came not as a gentle request, but as a command from the sun. It started as a whisper, the slow, rhythmic drip of water from the cabin eaves, a sound Clara had not heard in months. Soon, the whisper became a chorus, as the great mounds of snow sighed and settled, weeping their winter weight into the soil. The creek, long silenced by a thick armor of ice, began to stir with a deep, gurgling groan. The air lost its razor edge, softening with the smell of damp earth and pine needles. The mountain was waking up, stretching its vast, frozen limbs. When Elias finally opened the cabin door to a world that was not blinding white, the air that rushed in was cool but alive. Clara stepped over the threshold, her feet clad in a pair of his old wool socks, and drew in her first breath of spring. It was a raw, clean scent that spoke of possibility. The world was no longer just the four walls of the cabin. It was a sprawling expanse of rock, mud, and emerging green. A new, unspoken rhythm settled between them. The confinement of the storm had forged a strange familiarity, and with the freedom to move outside, that familiarity grew into a quiet partnership. Clara found a purpose in the small, daily chores that gave shape to their lives. Elias had a few scrawny chickens that had survived the winter in a small, sheltered coop. She took to feeding them, her heart lifting at their eager, clucking greetings. She patched Elias's worn shirts with a neatness that surprised even herself, the simple act of mending something feeling like a quiet rebellion against a life of being broken. Her favorite task was tending to his horse, a stoic, intelligent creature named Buck. She would brush his dark coat until it shone, her hands moving in long, soothing strokes. The horse would lean into her touch, its large, dark eyes soft and trusting. In these moments, she felt a connection to another living being that was simple and pure, free of the complicated fears that shadowed her interactions with people. Elias worked with a relentless, focused energy. He repaired the fence around his small pasture, his axe ringing out in the clear mountain air. He cleared fallen trees, his movements economical and powerful despite the slight drag of his right leg. And then, one morning, he began felling trees on the east side of the cabin. For days, he worked from sunup to sundown, hewing the logs with a skill that was both brutal and precise. Clara watched him, unsure of his purpose. She began to help in small ways, clearing away branches, bringing him water. He accepted her presence with a silent nod, just as he accepted everything else. Slowly, a new structure began to take shape beside the cabin. It was a small room, barely large enough for a cot and a small table, but it was separate, with its own door and a small window cut into the south-facing wall. He was building it for her. The realization settled in her slowly. It was a gift of something she had never truly had. Privacy. A space that was hers alone. A door she could close against the world. He finished it in just over a week, the fresh-cut wood smelling sweet and clean. He moved the cot he had set up for her inside, along with a small crate to serve as a table. He said nothing, simply gestured toward the finished room. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick. He just nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant peaks, and went back to chopping firewood. But she noticed something in those long days of working side by side. He would watch her sometimes, but only when her back was turned. If she was hanging laundry on the line he had strung between two pines, or tending the small garden patch she had started, she would feel the weight of his gaze. But the moment she turned, his attention would be on his work, his face a mask of concentration. It was not the predatory gaze of a man like Horn, nor the calculating look of Silas. It was something else, something quieter and more complex. It was as if he were trying to solve a puzzle, or perhaps simply trying to understand that she was real. One afternoon, as they sat on the cabin steps, sharing a meal of rabbit stew, the silence between them felt comfortable enough for her to dare a question. It had been circling in her mind for weeks. "Elias," she began, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at her, his gray eyes patient. "Why did you help me?" He chewed his bread slowly, considering the question as if it were a physical object. He looked out at the vast, indifferent mountains that ringed their small clearing. "You were alone," he said finally. The words were simple, flat, but they held the weight of a complete philosophy. It was not about pity, or chivalry, or desire. It was about a fundamental law of his own making. People should not be left to die alone in the snow. She swallowed, emboldened by his directness. "Do you want anything from me?" It was the question that had defined her whole life, the prelude to every transaction. She braced herself for the answer, but Elias did not speak. He simply looked at her, and for the first time, his gaze held a flicker of something that might have been sadness. He gave a single, slow shake of his head. Then he stood up, took their empty bowls inside, and the conversation was over. His answer, that simple shake of the head, was more disorienting than any demand would have been. It unmoored her, leaving her adrift in a world where the old rules did not apply. If he wanted nothing from her, then who was she supposed to be? Sometimes, when the sound of his axe splitting wood echoed through the clearing, Elias would freeze, his body would go rigid, his knuckles white on the handle, his eyes staring at something far beyond the trees. Clara learned not to approach him in these moments. His mind was somewhere else, a place of smoke and screams. She could see the ghosts of it in his eyes. The war had left its mark, not just on his leg, but on some deeper part of him. It was in the way he never sat with his back to a door, the way he could go utterly still and silent, blending into the landscape like a deer. There were other ghosts, too. One rainy afternoon, while searching for some twine in a large wooden chest at the foot of his bed, her fingers brushed against a smaller, tin box tucked away in a corner. She knew she should not open it, but an irresistible curiosity took hold. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were a handful of letters and several charcoal sketches. The drawings were of a farm, a place with rolling hills and a wide, welcoming porch, so different from the harsh beauty of the mountains. There were sketches of a woman's face, her hair piled high, a gentle smile on her lips. The letters were addressed to a family back in Ohio. The early ones were full of a young man's hope, talk of the army, of seeing the country. The later ones, written after the war, were different. The handwriting was tighter, the words more sparse. He wrote of a wife, Mary, and of trying to settle down, but his words were haunted by a deep weariness. The last few letters were unsent, their ink faded. They spoke of a profound silence from the other end, of a family that no longer wrote back, of a wife who looked at him as if he were a stranger. The final, unfinished letter ended with a simple, stark sentence. "There is no one left to write to." Clara closed the box, her heart aching. He had not just retreated from society, he had been cut adrift from it. He had lost faith in the bonds that were meant to hold people together, family, love, home. All he had left was a fierce, quiet belief in simple decency, the kind that made a man stop for a half-frozen girl in a ravine. As the days warmed and lengthened, A new kind of intimacy grew between them, fragile and unspoken. It was not in grand gestures, but in the smallest of actions. When a button came loose on his shirt, she would take it from him without a word and sew it back on. Her head bent in concentration. He would stand perfectly still, his large frame looming over her, until she was finished. Her hair, which she had kept in a ragged, tangled knot, became a nuisance as she worked. One evening, as she struggled with a comb, he wordlessly took it from her. She froze, then slowly turned and sat on the floor before him. His hands, calloused and rough from years of hard labor, were impossibly gentle as he worked through the knots. He was slow, patient, his fingers brushing her neck as he gathered her hair and wove it into a single, thick braid. The silence in the cabin was so complete she could hear her own heartbeat. When he was done, he rested his hands on her shoulders for a bare second before pulling away. They never spoke of it, but every few days he would braid her hair, a silent ritual that bound them closer than words ever could. Her thin dress was falling apart, and the coming warmth would not last forever. One day, a grizzled old trapper named Gus, a friend of Elias's, made a rare appearance, his mule laden with furs. Elias spoke more to Gus in 1 hour than he had spoken to Clara in 3 months, before the trapper left. Elias pressed some money and a piece of paper into his hand. Weeks later, Gus returned. He handed Elias a heavy parcel wrapped in brown paper. Inside were a pair of sturdy leather boots, trousers made of durable canvas, a simple cotton shirt, and a thick wool coat. They were for her. She held them up, her eyes wide. They were plain, practical clothes, but to her, they were the finest things she had ever owned. "Why did you not take me to town?" she asked Elias later, her voice soft. He was sharpening a knife by the fire, his face illuminated by the flickering light. "No need for anyone else to see you," he said, his voice a low rumble. It was not a command, but a statement of fact. He was building a wall around her, protecting her from a world he knew to be cruel and greedy. One hot afternoon, he was splitting a massive log, the muscles in his back and shoulders cording with the effort. He had taken off his shirt, and the sun shone on his skin. Clara, bringing him a dipper of cool water, stopped short. His back was a landscape of old wounds. A long, jagged scar ran from his shoulder blade down to his ribs, the work of a blade. Lower down, near his waist, was the puckered, star-shaped mark of an old bullet wound. They were the marks of a life lived in violence, so different from the fleeting, shameful bruises she had carried. These were a permanent part of him. An impulse, born of a deep, burgeoning empathy, moved her. She reached out, her fingers trembling slightly, to trace the line of the longest scar. Before she could touch him, he stepped away, turning to face her. His eyes were not angry, but they were guarded, closed off. "That's not for you to carry," he said softly. He took the dipper from her, drank the water, and went back to his work, leaving her standing there with the ghost of a touch on her fingertips. He was determined to keep his pain his own. The fragile peace of their mountain sanctuary was shattered by the arrival of a stranger. He was a hunter, a talkative man with a rifle slung over his shoulder and a brace of rabbits tied to his belt. He had seen the smoke from their chimney and hoped to trade for some salt. Elias was civil but wary, standing in the doorway, his body language a clear barrier. Clara was inside, putting away their dinner bowls, when the hunter's voice changed. "Well now, I'll be," he said, a note of surprise in his tone. "I've seen you before." Clara froze, her back to the door. "Man down in Carson City, a merchant named Horn, put a notice out, looking for a girl who ran off. Said she was his property. There's a reward." The hunter chuckled. "Small thing, but enough for a few good nights in town. That's you, ain't it?" The air in the cabin grew thick and cold. Clara could feel the hunter's eyes on her, feel the world she had escaped clawing its way back up the mountain. She turned slowly, her heart a cold stone in her chest. Elias did not move, but something about his stillness had become dangerous. "You're mistaken," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "The girl you're looking for died in the winter storms. Now, you best be on your way." The hunter looked from Elias's unyielding face to Clara's pale one. He saw the set of Elias's jaw, the way his hand rested near the rifle propped just inside the door. The hunter was no fool. He gave a nervous laugh, tipped his hat, and backed away, melting back into the trees. The moment he was gone, Elias shut and barred the door. He did not speak to her, but his quietness was different now. It was the tense, watchful silence of a predator. For the rest of the day, he patrolled the clearing, his rifle in his hands, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line. The hunter was gone, but the threat he brought with him remained, a poison in the air. That night, Clara could not sleep. The peace she had found was a fragile illusion. She was still just a piece of property, a thing with a price on its head, the old fear, the one that had been her constant companion for years, returned with a vengeance. She had to know. She had to ask the question that mattered more than any other. She rose from her cot and went to where Elias sat by the dying fire, cleaning his rifle. He looked up as she approached, his face grim in the shadows. Her voice trembled, but she forced the words out. "Would you sell me?" she asked, the question hanging between them, raw and terrible. "If someone paid you enough." Elias stopped what he was doing. He laid the rifle across his lap and looked at her, his gray eyes searching hers in the dim light. He seemed to understand the lifetime of pain and fear that was coiled inside that one question. His answer, when it came, was not what she expected. It was not a promise or a reassurance. It was a declaration of truth, a shifting of the entire world beneath her feet. "You're not mine to sell," he said. Elias's words, "You're not mine to sell," had settled in the small cabin like a foundation stone, something solid for Clara to build upon. As spring bled into the long, warm days of summer, a fragile peace took root. The sun baked the earth until it smelled of sweet dust and pine. Wildflowers erupted in a riot of color across the high meadows, and the air hummed with the drowsy buzz of bees. For the first time in her memory, Clara felt the simple, uncomplicated joy of being alive. She learned the names of the flowers, the calls of the birds. She felt the sun on her skin not as a harsh glare, but as a warm, welcome touch. The future was still a terrifying blank, but the present, for the first time, felt like a home. The quiet life they had built was a shield, but it was a fragile one. The world did not forget a debt, and men like Jedediah Horn did not forget their property. The danger came on a hot, still afternoon when the air was thick and heavy, promising a thunderstorm. It began not with a shout, but with the faint, unnatural sound of shod horses climbing the trail. Elias heard it first. He was splitting wood, the rhythmic thud of his axe a familiar heartbeat in the clearing. He stopped mid-swing, his body going unnaturally still, his head cocked as he listened to something only he could hear. Clara was nearby, weeding the small vegetable garden, her hands deep in the warm earth. He turned to her, his face grim, his eyes conveying a silent, urgent command. He pointed toward the cabin, then made a sharp, downward gesture. Inside, hide. Fear, cold and immediate, washed over her, chasing away the summer warmth. She scrambled to her feet and ran, her heart pounding against her ribs. Elias was right behind her. He did not ask questions or waste time. Inside the cabin, he lifted the large bearskin rug from the floor, revealing a trap door she had never known was there. He pulled it open, exposing a shallow, dark space beneath the floorboards, used for storing roots and supplies through the winter. It smelled of damp earth and potatoes. "Get in," he said, his voice a low, hard command. "Do not make a sound, no matter what you hear." She slid into the cramped space without hesitation. As he lowered the door, plunging her into near total darkness. She saw him grab the rifle from its place by the wall. The last thing she saw was his face, a mask of cold resolve. Then the rug was kicked back into place, and the heavy thud of his boots moved toward the front door. She curled into a tight ball, pressing her face against the cool dirt. Her body trembled uncontrollably. This was a familiar terror, the helplessness of being hunted, of being trapped while her fate was decided by others. Above her, she heard the heavy tread of 2 pairs of boots on the cabin's porch steps. A voice, slick and confident, cut through the afternoon quiet. "Man of the house?" the voice called out. She heard the cabin door creak open. Elias did not reply. "We're looking for someone," the voice continued, closer now, inside the cabin. "A girl ran off from Jedediah Horn back in the spring. Word is she came up this way. We have a contract of sale. She belongs to Mr. Albright, a businessman in Carson City. He's a man who likes his investments protected." Clara held her breath, her nails digging into her palms. She could hear them walking around above her, their footsteps shaking dust from the floorboards into her hair. There was a girl. Elias's voice was a low rumble, as steady and immovable as a boulder. "Found her in a ravine near here. End of winter. She didn't make it." A moment of silence. Clara's heart hammered so loudly she was sure they could hear it. "Is that so?" a second voice said. This one rougher, less patient. "Convenient. Where's she buried?" "By the creek," Elias said, his tone flat. "Buried her myself when the ground thawed. The wolves had already been at her. Not much left to see." The lie was so stark, so brutal, it almost made Clara gasp. He delivered it with the chilling finality of truth. More footsteps, the scrape of a chair being moved. They were searching. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying they would believe him, praying they would leave. "You live up here all alone?" the first voice asked, a note of suspicion in it. "Lonely life. We heard different. We heard from a hunter that the girl was alive and well not a month ago." "Hunters see things in the woods," Elias said. "Shadows play tricks. You want to go digging by the creek, be my guest, but you're wasting your time." There was another long pause. Clara could hear the soft whisper of cloth, the creak of leather. One of the men was standing directly above her. She could almost feel his weight through the wood. "All right," the slick voice said finally. "We'll take your word for it. For now. But Mr. Albright has a long reach. If we find out you're lying, if you've interfered with his property, well, this lonely cabin of yours might just have an accident. Fire spreads fast in the summer." The threat hung in the air, thick and oily. She heard their boots move toward the door. The door opened, then closed. She waited, every muscle screaming with tension. After what felt like an eternity, she heard Elias move to the door, bar it, and then walk back across the room. The rug was pulled away, and the trapdoor lifted. Sunlight streamed in, blinding her. Elias's hand reached down for her. She took it, her own hand trembling like a leaf. He pulled her up into the stuffy, hot air of the cabin. She stood there, covered in dust and shaking, unable to speak. Elias was already at the small window, his rifle in his hands, watching the 2 men ride away. He stood there for a long time, until their figures were just specks in the distance. When he finally turned back to her, his face was carved from granite. He did not have to say anything. The peace was gone. The sanctuary had been breached. As he turned from the window, his eyes caught on something on the back of the chair by the hearth. Clara followed his gaze. It was a small linen scarf, one she had been mending. In her haste to hide, she had left it there. It was a pale blue, the color of a summer sky. She remembered the second man, the silent one, lingering by the hearth. He must have seen it, a woman's scarf in the cabin of a man who claimed a woman had died months ago. It was a small thing, but it was enough. They knew Elias was lying. They would be back. Guilt was a sickness that settled deep in Clara's stomach. She was a plague, a curse brought upon this quiet man's life. She had watched him that evening as he methodically checked the perimeter of the clearing, his movements deliberate and tense. He was preparing for a war she had brought to his doorstep. His solitude had been a choice, a shield against the world. She had become a crack in that shield. She could not bear it. As he sat by the fire that night, cleaning his rifle with a fierce, focused intensity, she found the courage to speak. "I have to leave," she said. The words came out in a choked whisper. He did not look up from his work. "No." "They'll come back, Elias. They'll hurt you, or worse. This is my fight, not yours. I brought this here." "You're safe here," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. He pushed a cleaning rod through the barrel of the rifle. It was a sound of finality. "I'm not safe anywhere," she said, her voice breaking. "And I'm not making you safe. Please, let me go." He finally looked up, his pale eyes meeting hers across the flickering firelight. "Where would you go, Clara? Back to them, back to being sold and traded until there's nothing left of you. You're staying—" His refusal was absolute, a wall she could not breach. He was claiming responsibility for her, chaining himself to her fate. The realization undid her. A storm of gratitude, fear, and a desperate, aching loneliness washed over her. He had offered her safety, decency, a name. He had stood between her and the world that wanted to consume her. And in that moment, she was overwhelmed by a need to connect with him, to show him the tangled knot of emotion in her heart in the only way she knew how. She rose from her cot and walked to him. He watched her approach, his hands still on his rifle, his expression unreadable. She knelt in front of him, the firelight warm on her face. She reached out and gently touched his jaw, the rough stubble of his beard scratching her palm. Then she leaned in and pressed her lips to his. It was not a kiss of passion or of payment. It was a desperate, clumsy offering of everything she could not say. It was, "Thank you." It was, "I'm sorry." It was, "Please don't let me be alone again." It was a raw and honest plea. Elias remained perfectly still. He did not pull away, but he did not kiss her back. His lips were a firm, unresponsive line beneath hers. He simply allowed it to happen, a silent, unmoving mountain. When she finally pulled back, her face flushed with a mixture of hope and shame. His eyes held a deep, profound sadness. "You don't owe me anything," he said, his voice soft but firm. "And I won't take what's not freely given." The words were not a rejection, not entirely. They were a lesson. He was once again drawing a line, not between them, but between the world she knew and the world he was trying to build for her, a world where affection was not a currency. He was handing her a power she had never been allowed to possess, the power of a free choice. But in that moment, it just felt like another kind of loneliness. For days, a new tension hummed between them. Elias's words echoed in her mind, leaving her confused and raw. She felt like a bird that had been caged its whole life. And now that the door was open, she had no idea how to fly. The emotions inside her, rage at the men who hunted her, fear of what was to come, and a deep, churning frustration at her own helplessness, had nowhere to go. One morning, she could not stand it anymore. While Elias was checking his snares, she saddled Buck, her movements jerky and frantic. She needed to escape, not from Elias, but from the suffocating confines of her own skin. She rode the horse hard, urging him up a steep, winding trail that led away from the cabin, higher into the rugged peaks. The wind whipped her hair and stung her eyes, but she pushed onward, seeking the highest, most desolate place she could find. She came to a rocky, windswept ridge that offered a dizzying view of the world below. The cabin was a tiny speck, the vast expanse of the plains a hazy line in the distance. It was a world that had owned her, used her, and discarded her. And up here, on the roof of the world, she was finally alone with her pain. A sound started in her throat, a low, guttural growl. It built and built, fueled by years of forced silence, of swallowed tears and bitten-back cries. And then she let it out. She screamed. It was a raw, ragged sound, torn from the deepest part of her soul. It was a scream of rage for her father's betrayal, for Silas's callousness, for Horn's cruelty. It was a scream of fear for the men who were coming, for the violence that seemed to follow her everywhere she went. It was a scream of grief for the girl she had been and the woman she had never had a chance to become. It was the sound of a spirit breaking open. She screamed until her throat was raw and her lungs burned, the sound swallowed by the vast, indifferent emptiness of the mountains. When she was done, she collapsed, sliding from the saddle to curl into a ball on the hard, rocky ground. The scream had emptied her, leaving her hollow and shaking. Sobs racked her body, the hard, painful tears of someone who had forgotten how to cry. She did not know how long she lay there, but eventually, she sensed a presence. She looked up through her tear-blurred vision and saw him, Elias. He was standing a few feet away, holding Buck's reins. He must have followed her. His face was unreadable, but he did not move toward her. He just waited, giving her the dignity of her grief. When the last of her sobs had quieted, he came and sat on the ground beside her, not touching, just a solid, comforting presence. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the clouds drift across the endless sky. "I want to be more than what they called me," she finally whispered to the wind, her voice hoarse. "More than property, more than someone's winnings, but I don't know how." It was the simplest, most honest confession of her life. She was lost, adrift between a past that defined her and a future she could not imagine. Elias did not offer any easy answers. He did not tell her it would be all right. He just looked at her, his pale eyes seeming to see straight into the broken heart of her. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently push a stray strand of hair from her face. His voice, when he spoke, was barely a whisper, but his words were an anchor in the storm. "Then start by staying." His words, "Then start by staying," were not a command, but an offering. They were a plot of unclaimed land upon which Clara could, for the first time in her life, choose to build something. The violent, cathartic scream on the ridge had not fixed what was broken inside her, but it had cleared the air, leaving behind a quiet space for something new to grow. The fear did not vanish, but it no longer held her in its paralyzing grip. It became a low, humming thing in the background, a reminder of the stakes, while a tentative, fragile curiosity about the future began to push its way toward the light. The change in her was not sudden, but a slow, quiet unfolding, like a fist unclenching one finger at a time. The silence that had once been her armor began to feel more like a cage, and she started to push against its bars. She began with questions, small and shy at first, tossed into the comfortable quiet of their evenings by the fire. "Where did you learn to build like that?" she asked one night, gesturing to the sturdy roof above them. Elias looked up from the harness he was mending, surprised by the directness of her question. "My father was a carpenter," he said, his voice a low rumble. Some of it stuck. Another night, watching him read by the flickering lamplight, she asked, "What was the war like?" His hands went still. A shadow passed over his face, and for a moment she thought he would retreat into his familiar silence. But he looked at the fire, his eyes seeing something far away. "Loud," he said, the single word heavy with meaning. "And it taught me that there are worse things than being alone." She learned about him in these small, broken pieces. He was from Ohio. He had 2 brothers he had not heard from in a decade. He had learned to track in the army and to be quiet from the animals in the mountains. Each piece of his past was a small, carefully offered stone, and she gathered them, building a picture of the man who had saved her. Her curiosity turned inward as well. On a shelf above Elias's bed sat a small, worn collection of books, a Bible, a copy of Shakespeare's tragedies, and a primer. Its pages dog-eared and softened with use. One afternoon, she took the primer down. Her own learning had been a haphazard thing, snatched in moments between chores and beatings. She could read simple words, but sentences often unraveled into a confusing jumble of letters. She sat at the table, tracing the letters with her finger, her lips moving silently. She stumbled, grew frustrated, but she did not stop. Elias watched her from across the room, his expression unreadable. After a while, he came and sat opposite her. He did not take the book from her or correct her in a way that made her feel small. He simply pointed to a difficult word. "That one is through," he said quietly. "The oyaku makes a strange sound." And so, their evenings took on a new ritual. After the chores were done, she would read aloud from the primer, her voice hesitant at first, then growing stronger. He would listen, offering a quiet correction when she faltered, his patience a steady, calming presence. He gave her a small, leather-bound journal he had never used, and a piece of charcoal. She spent hours practicing her letters, filling the pages with the alphabet, then with simple words, and then, over and over, she wrote her own name, Clara, Clara, Clara. Each time she wrote it, it felt less like a label someone had given her and more like a thing she owned. Their closeness grew in the shared space of these quiet lessons. It was an intimacy of the mind, a trust built on vowels and consonants. It was in this growing trust that she found the strength to unearth her deepest, most painful secret. It came to her one evening as she watched a doe and its fawn drink from the creek at dusk. The sight of them, so peaceful and complete, opened a wound in her that had never healed. That night, the cabin was filled with a heavy silence. Elias seemed to sense the change in her, the turmoil behind her eyes. He did not press, but his presence was a question. She waited until the fire had burned down to glowing embers, until the shadows in the corners of the room were deep and soft. "I was pregnant once," she said to the darkness. The words fell into the quiet room and seemed to hang there, impossibly heavy. Elias, who had been oiling a rifle part, went completely still. He looked at her, his face a mask of shadows. Waiting. The story spilled out of her in a broken, hushed whisper. It had been with Silas, her first husband. She had been young, barely 16, and terrified. He had not been pleased. A child was an inconvenience, another mouth to feed, a distraction from the gambling halls. But a small, fierce flicker of hope had ignited within her. A child would be hers, something to love that was not a part of any transaction. But the life of a gambler's wife was hard. The constant moving, the poor food, the cold nights spent waiting in wagons. One night, after a fall on an icy street, the pains had started. Silas had been in a saloon, and she had been alone in their small, rented room. The child, a boy she had already named Samuel in her heart, had been born too soon, a tiny, perfect, silent thing. She had held him for hours before Silas came back, drunk and angry at his losses. He had taken the small, blanket-wrapped bundle from her and buried it in an unmarked hole behind the saloon before they left town the next morning. He never spoke of it again. She had never spoken of it to anyone. The grief was a secret, shameful thing she had carried alone, a cold stone in her heart. As she finished her story, the tears she had held back for years began to fall. They were silent at first. Then her shoulders began to shake with quiet, racking sobs. Elias put down the rifle part. He moved from his chair and came to her, kneeling on the floor in front of her cot. He did not speak. He did not offer empty words of comfort. He simply opened his arms, and she fell into them. He held her, his large, strong arms wrapping around her as she wept. She buried her face in his chest, her tears soaking his shirt, and cried for the child she had never known, for the mother she had never been, for the years of pain and silence. He held her steady, his hand stroking her hair, a solid, unmoving presence in the storm of her grief. He was a silent witness to her sorrow, and in his silent embrace, she felt, for the first time, that her pain was real, that it mattered. The morning after her confession, the air in the cabin was different. A great weight had been lifted. By sharing her deepest wound, she had given him the ultimate trust, and he had honored it. The last of her fear of him, the deep-seated instinct that all men would eventually cause her pain, finally dissolved. A new resolve hardened within her. She would not just survive, she would build, if she was to stand. As he had said, she needed to stand on her own 2 feet. She began to watch him more closely, learning his skills. She took scraps of leather he discarded and, using his tools, began to fashion small pouches and sheaths. Her first attempts were clumsy, the stitches uneven, but she persisted, her fingers growing nimble and sure. She took a block of wood and one of his sharpest knives and began to carve. She made a spoon, rough-hewn at first, but functional. She sanded it smooth with a piece of rock until it felt warm and alive in her hand. She was creating things of value, things that were not tied to her body or her past. She was planning, for the first time, a way to make her own money, to be her own person. The thought was a revelation, a spark of light in a future that had always been dark. The world, however, was not finished with her. The blow came not as a rider on a horse, but as a piece of paper. Gus, the old trapper, arrived one afternoon on his monthly visit, bringing supplies and news from the nearest town. He handed Elias a folded, slightly crumpled letter. "A man in town gave me this," Gus said, scratching his beard. "Said it was for the man on this mountain. Paid me $1 to bring it." Elias took the letter, his face impassive. But as he unfolded it, a cold stillness came over him. Clara, watching from the cabin doorway, felt a familiar dread twist in her stomach. He read the short message, his jaw tightening. Then, without a word, he handed the paper to her. The handwriting was a crude, heavy scrawl. There was no signature, no name, only a handful of chilling words. "You'll never be free." The message was a ghost, a whisper from the past designed to remind her that she was still hunted, still considered property. It was a promise that they had not forgotten her. "We have to go," Elias said, his voice flat and hard. He was already turning, his mind working, planning their escape, deeper into the mountains, places they'll never find. His instinct was to run, to retreat further into the wilderness that had always been his refuge. It was the sensible thing to do, but as Clara stared at the words on the page, something inside her shifted. It was not courage, not yet, but a cold, hard anger. She had run from her father, from Silas, from Horn, from the men in the wagon. She had spent her entire life running. "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Elias stopped and turned to her, his eyes questioning. "Clara, they know where you are. They will come back, and they will come with more men. We can't fight them all." "I won't keep hiding," she said, the words feeling strange and powerful on her tongue. She looked from the letter to the vast, open sky. "I have been hiding in my own skin for 10 years. I am tired of running. I want to stand." He saw the look on her face, the new, unbending strength in her eyes, and he did not argue. He simply gave a slow, solemn nod. He understood. This was no longer just about his protecting her. It was about her learning to protect herself. The decision changed her. The next day, she took a pair of his shears, and with a steady hand, she cut her long hair. She chopped it short, to the nape of her neck, the thick braid falling to the floor like a severed rope. The feeling was one of liberation, of shedding a skin that no longer fit. She began wearing the canvas trousers he had bought for her every day, their practicality a form of freedom. She was no longer a prize to be displayed, but a woman who worked and fought. That afternoon, she went to him as he was checking his rifle. Teach me, she said. He looked from her face to the pistol he kept tucked in a holster by his bed. He understood immediately. He took out the small, heavy pistol, its metal cool and solid. He showed her how to load it, how to hold it, how to aim. He took her to a clearing a short distance from the cabin and set up a tin can on a stump. Her first shot was wild, the recoil jarring her arm, the sound deafening, but she did not flinch. She set her jaw, listened to his quiet instructions about her stance, her grip, her breathing, and tried again and again. She spent the rest of the day shooting, until her arm ached and her ears rang, until she could hit the can more often than she missed. The weight of the pistol in her hand was a new and terrible power, but it was her power. That night, the unspoken barrier between their sleeping spaces finally crumbled. The threat was no longer a distant possibility. It was a certainty. They needed to be ready. Without a word, Elias moved her cot from the small room he had built for her back into the main cabin, placing it near his own. The gesture was one of pure, practical protection. In the dark, they lay only a few feet apart, the space between them filled with a quiet, chaste intimacy. They were no longer afraid of closeness. They were two soldiers waiting for a battle, taking comfort in each other's presence. A few nights later, as they lay in the quiet darkness, listening to the chirping of crickets outside, Clara turned on her side to face him. He was a dark shape in the faint moonlight filtering through the window, a solid, reassuring presence. The love she felt for him was a quiet, deep, and powerful thing, a force that had been growing steadily in the safe harbor he had created for her. It was a love born not of obligation or debt, but of 1,000 shared silences, of quiet kindnesses, of mutual respect. She rose from her cot and went to his. She knelt beside him, and he turned to face her, his pale eyes luminous in the dark. She leaned down, her short hair brushing his forehead, and kissed him. This time, it was different. This time, he did not remain still. As her lips touched his, she felt him hesitate for a barest second, and then he kissed her back. His lips were soft, questioning at first, then firming with a slow, trembling certainty. It was not a kiss of hunger or demand. It was a kiss full of all the unsaid words that had passed between them for months. It was slow and deep and breathtakingly tender. It was the taste of wood smoke and loneliness, and a love that had been patiently waiting to be freely given and freely received. It was the quiet, trembling start of a new world. The kiss had changed the air between them. It had not erased the threat that hung over their small clearing like a hawk, but it had transformed the space within the cabin walls into something more than a shelter. It was now a home, fragile and besieged, but a home nonetheless. A new tenderness, quiet and profound, settled in the spaces between their words. A shared glance across the fire held a universe of understanding. A brush of his hand against hers as he passed her a cup of water was no longer an accident, but a small, deliberate act of connection. They were a single unit, their lives and their fates now intertwined by a love that had grown silently, like a stubborn mountain flower pushing its way through rock. They spent their days preparing. Elias taught Clara how to reload the pistol quickly, her fingers, once clumsy, now moving with a sure, steady purpose. They stockpiled dried meat and filled canteens with fresh water, their movements synchronized and efficient. They were two soldiers in a war of their own, waiting for the inevitable return of the enemy. But in the evenings, a quiet domesticity reigned. She would read to him from the Shakespeare book, her voice growing confident, and he would listen, his eyes closed, a rare, soft expression on his face. In these moments, it was possible to forget the world outside, to believe that their small circle of firelight was all that existed. The world, however, has a long and violent memory. They came just after dawn, when the morning mist was still clinging to the hollows and the air was cool and clean. This time, There were 3 of them. They did not try to be quiet. The sound of their horses was a deliberate intrusion, a statement of power. Elias and Clara were already awake. At the first sound, they exchanged a single, grim look. They moved without a word, a well-rehearsed drill. Elias took his rifle from the wall. Clara strapped the holster with the small pistol to her hip. They stood together in the center of the cabin, waiting. The men dismounted, their boots crunching on the gravelly soil. One was the slick talker from before, a man named Finch. The other was the silent, watchful one whose name she never learned. The third man was new. He was older, with a portly belly and a tin star pinned to his vest, a deputy. The deputy stepped forward, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. He held up a piece of paper. "Elias Kane," he said, his voice loud and official. "I have a warrant for your arrest. Obstruction of justice and harboring stolen property." "She's not property," Elias said, his voice a low growl. His rifle was held loosely in his hands, but it was aimed at the deputy's chest. "That's for a judge to decide," the deputy said, a smug look on his face. He held out the paper. "This here is a contract of sale, notarized and legal, transferring ownership of the woman known as Clara from Jedediah Horn to Mr. Alastair Albright of Carson City. The law is on our side. You will stand down and hand the girl over." They were using the law as a weapon, twisting its words to justify their greed. Elias did not move. His silence was more defiant than any shout. "Do not make this difficult, Kane," the deputy warned, his hand tightening on his gun. "We can take you in alive, or we can take your body back with the girl. It makes no difference to us." It was in that moment, seeing Elias standing as a lone bulwark between her and the world, that Clara knew she could no longer hide behind him. This was her life they were bargaining for. This was her soul they were claiming to own. She had to speak for it herself. She stepped out from behind Elias, moving to stand beside him. The men's eyes widened in surprise. She was not the cowering, terrified girl they had been hunting. Her hair was short, practical. She wore trousers, and the pistol at her hip was not an ornament. She looked directly at Finch, the man with the contract. Her voice, when she spoke, did not tremble. It was clear and cold as mountain water. "That piece of paper is a lie," she said. "You lost the right to speak for me when you bought me like a mule." The word struck the men like a physical blow. The deputy's smug expression faltered. Finch looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, not as an object, but as a person, and he did not like it. A tense, dangerous silence descended on the clearing. The silent man broke it. His eyes, cold and empty, met Clara's. He saw her defiance, her refusal to be broken, and he made his decision. His hand moved in a blur, drawing the pistol from his holster. But Elias had been waiting for it. He was a man forged in the violence of war, and his reflexes were honed to a razor's edge. Before the man's gun had even cleared its holster, Elias's rifle cracked, the sound a single deafening explosion that echoed off the mountains. The silent man cried out, a sharp, ragged sound of pain and surprise. He stumbled backward, his gun falling from his numb fingers, his hand clutching his shoulder where a dark, wet stain was already spreading across his shirt. The deputy and Finch stood frozen for a second, their faces a mask of shock. They had come expecting to intimidate a lone mountain man, not to walk into a firefight. Their bluster evaporated, replaced by raw, animal fear. Finch scrambled to help his wounded companion, half dragging him toward the horses. "This is not over! Kane!" the deputy shouted, his voice shrill as he backed away. "We'll be back with 12 men. You'll hang for this!" They mounted their horses and fled, disappearing back down the trail, leaving their wounded man's trail of blood on the dusty ground.